What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to Eat, Train, Prosper. We are going to be talking about deloads and training age dependent relative intensity as I believe the title, but I can't see it all and I made it before and I don't want to say it wrong, but it's going to be close to that. We're going to dive into those in a little bit, but as always, before we jump into it, Bryan, can you kick us off with some updates, please?
Yeah, man, just a few updates today. So last episode in the updates, I talked about how my bike broke, the valve snapped or whatever as I was trying to go out for my long ride on Monday, and my bike was in the shop. Well, I wasn't able to ride for 2 days. And so by the time I got my bike back Tuesday evening, I had this big ride planned for Wednesday morning. The idea was to do close to 50 miles at race pace. So I mostly wanted to kind of emulate what it was going to feel like for me to go out and ride for 50 miles against other people with the intention of pushing myself beyond zone 2 consistently. So I did. I went out, I packed my Camelback or hydration pack. I had some protein in there, some Gatorade, a bunch of electrolytes, extra thing of water as well. And I went on my ride, and it was really hard the entire time. It took me 2.5 hours to go 45 miles, and I only didn't make it 50 because I ran out of liquid. So that happened at about 40 miles. So I had to go 5 miles without liquid, which isn't a big deal. I'd already consumed over 2 liters of liquid throughout the first 2 hours. But I ended up doing the 45 miles. Of that 2.5 hours, I spent 55 minutes in zone 4, 13 minutes in zone 5, and an hour in zone 3. So that's like 2 hours and 10 minutes was zone 3, zone 4, or zone 5. And then I spent like 20 minutes in zone 1 or zone 2. And so it was the most time I've spent in those high zones in one session ever. And I got back from my ride and I was sitting outside of the garage and I felt my stomach kind of like start bubbling up, and I was like, oh shit, I need to go to the bathroom. And I put my bike in the garage, ran to the bathroom, sat on the toilet for like 20 minutes and didn't feel any better afterwards. And for the next 30 hours, I would say, until probably the afternoon the following day, it was repeats of that same situation. It was me running to the toilet, not feeling any better afterwards. The symptoms being waves of body chills where I'd feel fine and be like, oh, I think I'm getting better. And then like 10 minutes later, I'd get these awful body chills and my stomach would cramp up like it was seizing. And anytime that I ate anything, it would get worse immediately. And I'd have to run back to the bathroom again. And so this probably happened like every hour, literally for like 30 hours, not including nighttime where I think I only had to run to the bathroom 3 or 4 times throughout the night. But basically, long story short here, I still am not 100% sure whether all of these sickness issues I was having are a direct result of the bike ride itself, or if I was going to get sick anyways. I put this out to Instagram. I asked a few of my endurance friends that I have that maybe don't follow me on Instagram. And it seems like the general consensus is that these types of post-workout sickness sensations may last for 3 to 4 hours after a really hard workout, but only one person reported that they would last 24 hours or longer. And I would say 30 people responded. So 29 people said that it was very unlikely that my sickness was from the ride itself. Like I said, I'm still not sure. And I don't know if I want to test it again before the race, because the race is now in like 2.5 weeks, I think. Oh, this is 3.5. I think it's 2.5. But anyway, it's October 7th. I'm probably not going to do another 45-mile hard ride like that. So I think I just need to be a little bit more cognizant of my nutrition beforehand, because I did go into this ride fasted, even though I brought all of that liquid nutrition with me, and I started consuming it immediately upon riding. I think I need to consume some food before riding when it's this intense and this long. And I think I need to bring the 3-liter hydration pack instead of the 2-liter hydration pack, just to ensure that I don't run out. And a couple people also suggested that maybe I bring some food instead of just liquid nutrition. So maybe I bring a bar or something along those lines. So yeah, that's the initial story there. Since that event, I I wasn't able to eat really or keep anything down for a couple days. And my body weight dropped as low as 184 pounds the day after being sick, which is 2 pounds away from the lowest I've been in the last decade. So that's pretty wild. But since then, I've been biking consistently again, not getting sick, getting tons of food in my body. And as of today, this morning, I'm back up into the high 180s. So things are kind of normalizing there. And I have another long ride planned for today. Not going to be intense, but I am going to go long and just make sure I'm hydrated and all that good stuff. I have 2 more quick updates, but let's jump over to Aaron and see what he has to say on things.
No, I want to hear about the solo dad month. I'm like foaming at the mouth for this because if I think about it, this is like a massive nightmare for me. So
well, So I wrote in the notes that I have a month of solo dadding, and it's not actually an entire month of solo dadding. And to be honest, I'm already halfway through that month. So September is essentially Kim's month and October is my month. So in September, Kim had a short trip to San Diego earlier in the month. Kim and I had that concert that we went to. So I guess that was like one day for me as well. But now things are getting real because Kim is in San Francisco this entire week, Monday through Friday. So I'm here this whole week by myself. And then she's back for 4 days. And then on Wednesday next week, she leaves for Paris for a week. And she doesn't get back from that until I think the first week in October or something like that. And so then once she gets back from Paris, there's like a 2 or 3 day period. And then I leave for my bike race. And so I'm gone for that for like 3 days. And then I get back and there's like a 1 week period, maybe 1.5. And then I go to Bermuda for a week. So October is my month, September's her month, but I'm basically in the thick of it right now. And I have of the next 17 days, I will be solo dadding for 12 or 13 of them with her out of the country. So that's the story there, more or less. It's not the end of the world with the kids in school as long as they don't get sick. The hardest part is really just weekends, which are daunting even with 2 parents, and the morning routine, getting them ready for school, and then the bedtime routine, getting them both to sleep at night. Those are struggle times, but for the most part, I should still have, my 8 or 9 hours in the middle of the day. And so I'm not really like super stressed about the whole situation.
Okay. That's a very, very like mature and eloquent approach to it. I was thinking I was preparing for like worst case scenario. I was like, whoa, a month and you got 2 kids by yourself. Like, what do you do? How do you manage? But it doesn't sound as, like apocalyptic as I had previously thought.
Yeah, 12 of 17 days is no walk in the park, but I think I'm going to survive.
Okay, so I'll cover mine quick and we'll get into it. So the first thing is a number of weeks now. It might even be a couple months back. We briefly discussed some of Peter Attia's kind of his like, not necessarily his like strength and longevity thresholds is a good way to describe it. And one of them was a 2-minute dead hang from a pull-up bar, and this was for males. I believe the female equivalent that he likes to use or benchmark is 1.5 minutes. And the other day at the gym, I was like, the other evening I was like, I'm just gonna do it. Right? I had to do some. It was a cardio day, and so I have my upper body wasn't necessarily taxed, and I was like, I'm just gonna go for it. And I set the timer on my watch that I couldn't see, and I just like jumped up and hung on. And I was really quite surprised. I made it like just over the 3-minute mark, like literally the 3-minute mark. And I was quite surprised. But also my forearms were blown the fuck up after. I really gave it like, I wasn't like, okay, this is hurting. Like I'm going to let go now. I like held on until the wheels fell off and like gravity pulled me off the bar. Yeah. I didn't quit on it, which I was proud of myself after the fact, but like my forearms were in quite some pain.
Yeah, you go to that point until they just start like sliding off.
Yeah.
And it's like paint like peeling off a wall or something. Yeah. No, I know, dude. Kim and I did it together one day. I did not do as well as you. I got just shy of 2 minutes. I think it was like 1:55 or something like that. But this was also, Kim was working out. And I walked downstairs to help her take 100 pounds off of the hack squat machine. And she was like, you need to do this test, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I'm in a hoodie and sweatpants and I'm cold and I don't want to do this right now. And she's like, do it, whatever. So I did it. But I think I'll need to try it at some point again after I'm actually like properly warmed up and mentally prepared for the challenge instead of just being told to jump up there. But I see no way that I'm going to make 300 or 3 minutes. That's quite impressive.
I think that my only saving grace is I've been doing a lot of hanging like leg raises.
Yeah.
Since the beginning of the year, since I got my new program and I had started that like literally 3 times a week. I'm probably down to about 2 times a week now, but I do feel like much more capable in my like grip strength because I've been doing more hanging. So
cool. Well, the next one up is the Farmer's Walk Challenge.
Yeah, that one I think is that's the one I remember being like, there's no way in hell I can do that. So we'll have to test that one too.
Yeah, for sure.
Second thing I guess I have here is I had a PRP injection in my left triceps tendon. I've had a number of experiences with PRP dating back like a decade now. They've been all very, very positive. So I just kind of wanted to talk about it really quickly. If you have a tendon related injury out there and you don't necessarily want to go the surgery route, or it's not maybe quite necessary for a surgery, but it's chronic, it inflames a lot and you can't really seem to improve it. PRP can be a very, very reasonable approach for that. The downside, you pay out of pocket. I don't even know what it is in the States. Like I had up on my story, I was paying over $600 a pop for them literally a decade ago in San Diego. So I have no idea what it might be. I had about 6, I think, in my shoulder, 1 in my knee. And then I've had 1 in my right elbow here in Bali, and then 1 in my left elbow here in Bali. And I've cats still in the bag on my left elbow, but all of the other ones have been notable improvements for me with joint related pain.
So what do you experience as far as rehabilitation time, if you want to call it that, or like back to training time?
It's hard to say. I really don't remember a decade ago. I just don't. It was, and I had those 6 over like a number, maybe like a 2 to 3 month period. It was like I would go like every other week or something like that for them, maybe even separated more. My knee, it was after my patella repair surgery. I was about like 6 months after the surgery and there was still some lingering pain. And the doctor was like, let's just do a PRP injection. And then literally within a week after that one, the pain had just went away and it's never come back again. And that was in 2017, 6 years ago. The right elbow, which is the most recent, I took it really easy on it and like didn't train any pull or push for probably like about 5 days after. And then, make sure I warmed it up like really, really well. And then that one, just maybe about a week and a half, 2 weeks later, pain just dissipated and it's been gone since. And now with this left one, I'll pretty much do the same. But I would say the left one is by far like the spiciest of the recent ones. Like if I bump my elbow on something, like it's excruciating, like sharp pain.
Yeah.
It's also set in the fastest. So we'll see. I'll give it, 2 weeks or so and see if I notice the improvement there.
So how long ago did you do this? A day or 2?
Just over 24 hours.
Yeah. And what does it feel like right now? Does it feel like stiff, tense? Can you straighten your arm and bend it and stuff without pain? Or
yeah, I could straighten it, bend it. It was very and I don't know if inflamed is the best term, but there was a bunch of fluid injected into a tendon in a very small area. It was, pressure is a really good way to put it. A lot of pressure last night. I did my best to like not sleep with my arm really stretched or anything like that. And then this morning I could still feel some pressure and it kind of dissipated throughout the day.
Cool.
So it feels almost normal now.
Yeah. So you said you just basically take it easy on movement for like a week or 2, but you think by 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you'll be back to moving the same weights you were moving before?
I may be a little apprehensive on certain things that I know will really light it up, like a lengthened, overhead tricep extension or something like that. But pulling, I would imagine, yes, like grip type things will be pretty much normal. I will probably avoid some isolation things, at least for the rest of this week, and just do only like, compound like pressing and that sort of stuff where it's not like direct tricep work. But kind of ironically, like the direct tricep work is what would inflame it the most. Even like,
Right.
kick like a shortened overload press back or something like that. But like heavy pressing wouldn't nearly be as discomforting.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like your recoveries from PRP have been better than my one experience all across the board. I know we talked about this last year when I got PRP in my knee, but yeah, it was, I would say it was 8 or 9 weeks until I was moving the same weights that I was moving pre PRP, and I couldn't even do anything on it at all for probably 2.5 or 3 weeks. So I don't know if it was like the type I got, where it was injected, anything like that. But yeah, definitely a longer recovery for me when it happened in my knee last year. So that's cool. I hope that you can get right back on track and keep going. Up until that point, I guess training fat loss camp is still going, but you're like modifying around it.
Yeah. I trained legs today, so I didn't. The only thing I did do is I like swapped my heavy RDL for like a very Dr. Mike-esque dumbbell stiff-legged deadlift with like the posterior anterior pelvic tilt, and just made it so I could get the stimulus out of a significantly less load. But other than that, everything else is the same. And then tomorrow's a rest day, and then I'll test push, but without the isolations.
Cool. Well, my last quick update was that I went to the gym at Prospect yesterday. I know you love that place, so I just figured I'd shout that on here. Still doing my full body training. All is going super well with that. Jordan Lips actually just changed over to a full body program similar to mine, as he's kind of also pursuing cardio goals at the moment. So he and I had a fun back and forth about that yesterday. But yeah, the gym at Prospect, we got to use that super prime row that you and I both love, and amongst other of those awesome machines there, but nothing too crazy to report. We did a little bit of filming for Paragon Training Methods new cycle, which we have coming out October 9th. It's going to be a glutes and shoulder specialization cycle with the option to turn glute dominant movements into quad dominant movements via change of torso angle and change of knee and ankle position. So you can either have it as a quad shoulder specialization cycle or a glute shoulder specialization cycle. So that'll drop October 9th for 6 weeks. We have a couple cool, fun new movements in there. And yeah, I see your last update here is that you seem to be quite enjoying your morning cardio.
I really have. And it took me a couple weeks to really kind of like suss it out, because I'd have some days where I'm like, dude, I feel great today. And then there's other days where I'm like, fuck, I don't really want to go to, I'm going to go train out of principle, but I'm not really excited to go there. And I find that when I have this office here, and it's like a detached room from the rest of the villa, and I close the, curtains sort of thing. And I like close if I like wake up, eat at 6:45 and come in here and start work by like 11ish, I just like I feel like kind of cabin feverish. And then it's like, I don't want to leave the villa, and get outside. And it's almost like a seasonal affective disorder sort of, feeling. But then the mornings where I get up, I'm at the gym by like 7:15, 7:30 doing that cardio. Like I just have like a heightened mood throughout the day. And I think it's just a little bit of like getting sweaty. I'll with the current fat loss camp, protocol, I get sweaty, I do some abs, I go in the sauna, and then I sit in the sun for like 10 to 15 minutes. And, my body temperature regulates a little bit before I head home. And I feel so much better on those days. And I think it's just like really kind of honed in on that. And I think for, the listeners out there who do have maybe control of their own schedule and those sorts of things, or have some time, and it's not like I'm like grinding doing, cardio stuff in the morning, but I just get sweaty, get my heart rate up, and I feel so much better throughout the day. And I think it's something I'm really going to carry on, past fat loss camp.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I'm really glad to hear that. I have a client, Jeff Hain, who has a podcast as well, the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. I've been on there a bunch, but he just started doing his zone 2 cardio in the last 6 weeks, maybe. And he just had his bachelor party this weekend. And the first thing he wanted to do when he got back from his bachelor party was sit on his bike and do his zone 2 so he could like sweat everything out, set the head right. And he's like, man, I just felt so much better after that. And he's also gotten to the point where he like really looks forward to these zone 2 cardio sessions now. And much like you, I even had an entire podcast on his channel about this, but he was very much of the mindset even a year or two ago that, cardio kills gains and impacts hypertrophy and all this stuff. And he's like, I have just noticed nothing but positive from it. And you and I have even talked about, and I made a post on Instagram about this a while ago, that in some ways, cardio actually has more applicability in a gaining phase to keep like your work capacity up, make sure that your blood markers are all functioning properly, and that, you're prioritizing health as you gain weight as well. And so I think there's a place for cardio now in any state of your training periodization year. And yeah, I just think it's been really cool to see all these people kind of jumping on the bandwagon and seeing positive benefit from it.
I echo a lot of that. I haven't released anything, publicly or talked on the podcast or posted much on Instagram yet, but I'm turning a corner in my fat loss to where like I have enough fat off now, where I can like the shape is coming in, and I'm excited. Let's just put it that way. I have never been this lean at 207. Things are really fun. Things are coming, and I'm very excited about it.
Very cool.
And I think the cardio is played a big role in that.
For sure. Yeah. Laura and I were actually just talking about you and your current physical state at the gym yesterday. And I was like, man, fucking Aaron is 207 and etched right now. Like it was wild because I was comparing it to when you were 192 like 2 years ago, and you hit the end of that diet and you were like pretty disappointed with what 192 looked like. And I was telling Laura, I was like, man, I don't even know if he has 15 more pounds of weight to lose right now. And like, if he did, he'd probably be stage ready. So there's that.
Yeah. So it's been very cool. And maybe we'll talk about it on an episode. I don't want to derail this one, but
yeah,
what I will say is I've given this year everything. And I think that's like, I've been on a meal plan since January 1st. It's September 19th. I deviate from that meal plan. I would say I averaged less than 2 meals per week deviation from that.
Yeah.
And I've given it all. I've stacked all those 1%ers, per se. They do add up, but it has to be important enough in your life for you to forego dates, fucking coffee, all these other social things. But for 99% of the people, it's not worth that. But it has made a difference, I have found, which is cool.
Very cool. So the first topic to discuss today here is going to be a little bit of insight into this Deload study. And neither of us really want to spend a ton of time and make this like an in-depth research episode. We just kind of want to briefly spend 10 or 15 minutes on these two different topics and just kind of spit some practical application back and forth. So this first study is actually a preprint, much like the meta-regression from Robinson and colleagues that we discussed a few episodes ago on training to failure. So this one is a preprint from Max Coleman, who is a student of Brad Schoenfeld, who I'm sure all of you guys will recognize that name. And Brad is he was the last author on this paper. So there was about maybe 7-8 authors, and Brad was the final one, I think, because he was just overseeing the project. But the study is essentially called Gaining More from Doing Less, ? The effects of a 1-week deload period during supervised resistance training on muscular adaptations. And essentially what they did here, without belaboring all of the details, is they had 2 groups. One group trained for 9 weeks straight, while another group trained for 4 weeks, took a 1-week cessation or break, and then trained another 4 weeks. And they did this with a 4 times a week upper-lower split routine. However, only the lower body work was performed in the lab as part of the study. And I believe the participants were told to train upper body the other 2 days on their own. The other interesting thing about this is that the lower body training, I was surprised because it didn't include any hamstring work. So it was 5 sets of 8 to 12 of Smith squat, leg extension, calf raise on a leg press machine, and seated calf raise. So they had 10 sets of calf raises, 5 sets of leg extensions, and 5 sets of Smith squats. And it looks like they did that twice a week. So each week they had 20 sets of calf raises and 20 sets of quads split between Smith squats and leg extensions. and it doesn't look like any hamstring work at all. It also says, to help standardize the intensity of effort, we verbally encouraged participants to perform all sets to the point of volitional failure, herein defined as the inability to perform another concentric repetition while maintaining proper form. So basically, they hoped the participants went to failure, but they don't really know. They just verbally encouraged them to do so. And just to throw this out there, if it was me trying to do 5 sets of 8 to 12 on Smith squat and leg extension twice a week, I don't think I would be going to failure on every one of those sets. So that lays the groundwork for the study, and I'll let you jump in with some thoughts, and then we can kind of discuss the results.
Yeah. So, I mean, hold on. Sorry. No, let me move away from that. I forgot that Brad Schoenfeld was the last one on the paper, and I had something to say, but that was incorrect. So, I mean, initially, like with most of these, the training protocol does leave some desires right into it, or questions, I would say, arise as to potentially why these things. Maybe it was just because they wanted to cover, just test the quad and the calf. There was, I don't know, maybe testing the size of a hamstring growth is, harder or something like that. Yeah. So there's definitely things that are up in the air. But the thing that's kind of why I wouldn't pull too much information, or takeaways from this one, is because of the relative duration. And I think this was something that kind of caught my eye, was deep down in the discussion session, where they note that the group that took the week break, they didn't feel refreshed. It was the term used, coming out of it. They felt lethargy and fatigued, sort of. And I think potentially, or part of the theory that's included in the paper, is because the deload was a cessation of exercise for that week, as opposed to reducing frequency, intensity, load, or something like that. And I do feel pretty confident in the takeaways. It's probably best to do something as opposed to nothing, as a decent takeaway from this paper.
Yeah, I would say that that's definitely one way to look at it. Another way, the way that I kind of look at it, is that nobody, or very few people, program in a manner where they just randomly, I guess I should say the way I'm going to say this. The RP method does have you kind of take these predetermined deload periods where it's hey, you're going to train for a 4 or 5 week period, and then you're going to deload for a week, and then do another 4 or 5 week and go from there. Most people in practice, at least people at the advanced level, I don't know too many people that pre-plan their deloads. Most people might have a general idea of hey, usually somewhere between 5 and 8 weeks, I usually need a deload. And then they train, and they wait until they reach a point where they're feeling likely psychologically fatigued, as we've discussed on this podcast before. And then they're shit, I am losing motivation. I don't really want to go to and past failure this week. I think I need a break. So they do whatever they do, whether it's 3 to 5 days off, or it's a week of, lower volumes, lower intensities. And then they get right back to training, and they keep going. And because this is a bit more intuitive, and its timeliness is dependent upon when the athlete feels the need for it, I think that changes the dynamic a little bit, versus being you're going to train 4 weeks, take an entire week off, and go back to training 4 more weeks. So I think there's that element of, like you said, doing nothing versus lowering intensity and volume, like most people do in practice, or taking a shorter period of time. Like my favorite way to deload is take 3 to 5 days off, not to take 7 days off. So that was interesting to me, as far as a practical application that people would be able to use this for. I do think the idea of being lethargic and unmotivated after a week completely off is reasonable, especially if you've only been training 4 weeks leading into that. Whereas I find when I take, 5 days off after training for 7 weeks, and I feel I need those 5 days, then I come back after those 5 days reinvigorated and ready to go. And so there's a lot of kind of extenuating circumstances like that included in there.
Yeah, I would say kind of takeaways from this one, or recommendations: proactively or reactively deloading. Reactively is probably a better approach than a proactive planned in week 4, I deload sort of thing, because there's huge amounts of individual variation, right? If you're in a surplus, you have higher recovery capacity. There's probably less, stressors with that because of the increased recovery capacity. Your sleep might be better. These sorts of things, like these are massive leverages that will impact like the accumulation of fatigue and these sorts of things. And I think, not considering those is a little bit short-sighted in how fatigue accumulates and those sorts of things. So when you feel the subjective and there's objective, right, regressions in training performance is a good way, preparedness, joint pain, different things like that. But it's probably, best to listen to yourself and the signals that your body is giving you for the deload, as opposed to, hey, I'm in week 4, time to deload sort of thing.
Yep, for sure. And then a lot of people in discussion around this that I've seen online and on podcasts and stuff, it seems like a lot of people are looking at this and taking from it this idea that, oh, well, you don't need to deload because you get the same results, which I guess, we haven't even discussed this, but basically both groups got the same results, plus or minus. So aside from that psychological piece that Aaron mentioned, where the deload group felt like a little unmotivated and lethargic, when you actually broke it down across groups and looked at muscle size increases, there was no statistical significantly difference between the two groups. So some people are looking at that and being like, you don't need to deload, see, because you get the same results. The way I would look at that is looking at it from a more forgiving way and saying, hey, you got the same results and you took an entire week off. Like you trained only 8 out of 9 weeks and you got the same results as the group that trained 9 out of 9 weeks. So this opens up a whole world of possibilities, at least in the short term, of, hey, I can go on vacation and take a week off and it's not a big deal. Or I got sick and, I had to take a week off, like not a big deal. Whereas imagine if the study had come the other way and it had been like way better results if you don't deload. Well, now people are going to be sitting here stressing, being like, oh, I went on vacation. Like I have to make sure I train during this period because #results. So that's one thing I thought was really interesting about it. And then it also made me think about an older study that we've referenced on the podcast before. And it literally took me like an entire 10-minute period rushing to try to find this study before we started the podcast this morning, but I finally found it. And so this other study is Ogasawara and colleagues, and it's a comparison of muscle hypertrophy following 6 months of continuous and periodic strength training. And I love this study because this is one you guys have probably heard, or many of you have, where they took 2 groups. One group trained 24 weeks continuously without stopping, and the other group did 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on, 3 weeks off, 6 weeks on. So they also had 24 weeks, and they finished with a 6-week on period, not with a 3-week off. At the end of that study, they also found not statistically significant differences between the groups. So whether you trained 18 of 24 weeks or trained 24 weeks, it didn't seem to make a difference. And this is a bit of an extreme case, whereas I think the other one was a little bit more ecologically valid, comparing to things that people might actually do in the gym. Like nobody's really going to train for 6 weeks and then take 3 weeks completely off. But it is really interesting that in this Ogasawara study, they were able to achieve the exact same strength and hypertrophy with the 3-week periods off. And the discussion around that essentially was more along the lines of what happened was these people detrained, so they lost strength and muscle, but because we know that it comes back so much faster than it's lost, that they were able to gain it back during each 6-week period. And so it's not a perfect validation of being like, hey, you can deload for 3 weeks every 6 weeks and it's not a big deal. It's more just like, hey, if you do take time off, we know that shit's going to come back really fast and you don't need to worry about it. So anyway, those 2 studies I think are interesting and have some similarities and some differences, but both of them seem to exemplify that taking time off doesn't seem to hurt your gains in the long term, as long as you're consistent over time.
Yep. You ready to move on to the second part?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So what we're going to talk about next comes from a graphic that was posted to Instagram by Chris Beardsley. It's also up on his Patreon and those sorts of things. Now, what I will say before we dive into this is nothing we are saying is kind of what I would recommend taking it as definitive, even at the let's call it the most academically credentialed level, these people still have disagreements with one another. We're really talking about like theories with varying supporting and maybe unsupporting research, that sort of thing. So basically what I'm saying is very few things are to be taken as like definitive truths quite yet. But with this one, I thought it made a lot of sense with what many of us, or pretty much all of us, experience through your training age. And what I thought was I would read through kind of the main parts of the post, and we'll make sure we put a link to it in the show notes and that sort of thing, and then we'll kind of open it up from there. So at the top, we have which motor units display hypertrophy after a workout likely depends on the training status of the lifter, with far more motor units being capable of growth in beginners. So to kind of back up a little bit, we have essentially these different thresholds of motor units that get recruited when you are performing an exercise. And the kind of gist of this is let's say you're doing a set of 20 on a leg extension. When you're in reps like 1 through 5, pretty much your low threshold motor units are being activated to do the work, right? Those are the ones that come in first when you are still quite far from failure. Once the reps begin to accumulate, you start to activate and recruit the next threshold of motor units. In this example, Chris breaks them down into pretty much like lowest threshold, motor units, a middle threshold, and then like the highest threshold. And then after you've essentially fatigued the capabilities of your middle tier of motor units, you move into your highest threshold motor units, which is, let's call it the closest activation period to failure. How close is kind of up for debate, so I'm not going to pick a number there just to be wrong pretty much regardless. But you won't get the maximum recruitment out of these until you are close in proximity to failure. And from an effort standpoint, probably putting in, let's say, 100% perceivable effort. So moving, along with this, one of the notes here, the first one is that the muscle fibers of low threshold motor units do not grow after any type of exercise in the gym. This is likely because they have already reached their maximum possible size by just being used constantly in daily activities of life. A very, very common place that people seem to think of this one is like the calves, right? Mm-hmm. Where you train the calves, and what it takes to actually add any kind of perceivable size to them is such a high effort and volume relative to like biceps, chest, back and the other muscle groups, because calves are pretty damn strong from just living life and walking on them pretty much constantly. It's a very, very good example. Beginners experience more rapid hypertrophy than well-trained lifters. This is a pretty established fact. This is likely because they can achieve hypertrophy in the muscle fibers of all high threshold motor units. So the lowest of the high threshold tiers, the middle threshold, and the highest threshold. It's also well known that intermediates display slower hypertrophy than beginners, something we all subjectively, experience and know to be true. This could be because they cannot achieve any growth in the fibers of the lowest high threshold motor units, because you've already kind of made all of the gains in those lowest fibers of the lowest high threshold motor units. So then you're only left to make gains in the middle tier and the highest tier of the threshold of motor units. And then moving from the intermediate to the advanced level, advanced lifters display very slow hypertrophy, which we all know to be, mostly true if we make it to that level. This is likely because they cannot achieve growth in the muscle fibers of either the lowest high threshold motor units or the muscle fibers of the middle high threshold motor units. They can likely only achieve growth in the muscle fibers of the highest high threshold motor units. So to kind of work this one back, I know I've been kind of reading a lot and spitting, verbatim Chris Beardsley at you. What I thought was really interesting when reading this is the kind of theory that your training intensities, relative intensities, meaning proximity to failure, likely need to increase as your training age increases to further elicit hypertrophy of the gains that you can make. In the beginning, when you're a beginner and you haven't made many gains, just going in and trying and doing some work, like there is progress to be made. As you net some of that progress, and therefore there is less total progress to be made, you need to work harder to make more. And then eventually, once you reach, I'm not even going to put a date on it. I was going to say a decade, but a long time. Once you've made some solid gains already, you have, let's call it an impressive physique relative to your genetic level and those sorts of things, age. To further make progress, your return on investment in terms of effort flips upside down quite high. There's much more significant effort in closer proximity to failure needing to be elicited and put in to net the least amount of hypertrophy that's left to be obtained. And what I thought was very just helpful and practical from this for you as the listener is to identify where along that kind of it's kind of like not an exponential graph, or maybe this is an exponential graph. I don't know. It's been a really long time since I've had that stuff in math, but anyway, kind of this like curve in I know it's so many people get so caught up on like, well, how hard should I train? And of course we released an episode and stuff on this, but I think it's a really good way to help you decide there. What are your thoughts on that, Bryan?
Yeah, it's interesting because the post like says a lot, but it doesn't really give any practical application. It's
Zero.
it's just, hey, this is happening probably. We don't know, but like this is likely a possible reason why we get less results as we get older. So if you go into the comments, you have people asking like, okay, so what am I supposed to do? And you listed training closer to failure, which I think is probably the most obvious solution given the way that he discussed that. It's, hey, these motor units, we if you go to failure, you've fatigued all of the motor units from the low, middle, and high threshold motor units. So going to failure is probably a good idea. One thing I took from this is you have Chris and Paul Carter both on this train of believing that the 5 to 8 rep range is basically the perfect rep range for everything, no matter what you're doing. Like you can lateral raise it for 5s, or, it doesn't really matter, like sets of 5 to 8 or where it's at. And so I kind of think that this infographic from Chris and everything that you broke down, it just further goes to support that idea that they put out there that 5 to 8 reps is perfect for everything. Because what we know about 5 to 8 rep sets is that you're essentially recruiting the highest level, highest threshold motor units from the very beginning. Like your reps are, quote, effective from the very first rep, versus in that example you used of the 20 rep leg extension, you have the low threshold motor units in reps 1 through 6 or whatever, then the middle ones from 6 to 15, and then from 15 to 20, you finally have to bring in these high threshold motor units. And inevitably, there's going to be like a fatigue cost associated with the first 15 reps to get you to the 20. And if you're an advanced athlete or trainee that has already, in Chris's eyes, kind of used up all your gains from the low and middle threshold units, then you're not getting anything positive from reps 1 through 15. Whereas somebody that's newer and has not exhausted all of their growth from the lower and middle threshold units, they might actually get some growth from those first reps of that set. So knowing what Chris and Paul tend to espouse, this led me to believe that they're just looking for another way to support that 5 to 8 rep range piece, which I think makes sense. I also love the 5 to 8 rep range, and I don't love everything that Paul and Chris put out. I think Chris puts out mostly good information, but I do think that in many ways that use of the 5 to 8 rep range also is supported in the Robinson and colleagues meta regression on training to failure, because what they basically show is that when you're doing those lower rep sets of 5, 6, 7 reps, where reps are effective from the beginning, you actually don't necessarily need to train as close to failure, because the units are all recruited from the beginning. And so I think if you kind of combine what we know from the meta regression and from the information that Robinson has been putting out with this infographic from Beardsley and kind of the general umbrella of information that Paul and Chris are putting out, that we can kind of narrow down into this range of 5 to 8 reps and realize that as long as we're training within 1 or 2 reps from failure in that 5 to 8 rep range, it's likely that we're fatiguing all of the desired motor units throughout the spectrum.
I love that you brought that up. It's a really, really excellent point. Playing devil's advocate kind of here, not on the rep range itself, but on the quality of the execution of those reps, right? Let's say we're performing a bicep curl in the 5 to 8 rep range. There's a way to do it, wonderfully. I would say in practicality or in practice, many lifters will perform those reps at a poor execution standpoint because the load is higher. And it's just like, I'm not saying it's necessarily wrong or anything, but there's like an asterisk, right? Like 5 to 8 rep range with, really good execution, not launching in those sorts of things, where I think this is where one of those things where like the theory I think is solid. I think it makes perfect sense. Many people will bastardize the execution of it because of what happens when reps drop and load increases.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I think in the Robinson meta regression, most of the studies that used the 5 to 8 rep range that they were referencing were these large compound movements. So you're not seeing studies, at least we don't have studies available, where you see someone doing laterals and bicep curls in the 5 to 8 rep range. They tend to use the 10 to 15 or 8 to 12 rep range for those types of movements. But when you look at Paul's training that he puts on Instagram, he's doing everything in that rep range. And he has a number of posts talking about how there's no reason you can't do movements in those rep ranges. With that said, I think that it comes down a lot to it being a short overload movement, making it difficult to train in that rep range, especially when it's like very highly significantly short overloaded. And so we're looking at, the bicep curl, some version of bicep curls are not as short, but like a standing dumbbell bicep curl, a dumbbell lateral raise type thing. Those movements, I do curls actually in the 4 to 8 rep range. I did a set yesterday of hammer curls where I did 50 pounds and I only got 4 reps, full reps. And then I did 7 partials. So I don't even know how that would fit into this spectrum of analysis, because I did 4 full reps, but then I basically exhausted all the motor units by doing 7 partials until I literally couldn't move my arm from the bottom anymore. And so there's a certain level of exhaustion that occurs there. And so did I do 4 reps or did I do 11 reps or did I do somewhere in between? I don't exactly know the answer to that. And I also think, you can take a movement like a lateral raise, and with dumbbells, it seems less feasible to do it for 5 or 6 reps. But when you set yourself up with cables coming from behind your back and you're setting them at wrist height, so it's more lengthened overloaded, I find extreme productivity from doing sets in the 5 to 6 rep range there. And so I think exercise selection certainly comes in and plays a major point. And so if you're going to take this approach practically and you want to start training in that lower rep range so that you recruit more of these high threshold motor units, then I think you need to also kind of look at your exercise selection and choose movements that are a bit more conducive to working in that rep range.
Agreed. And I think one last little part that I'll add on, and I think this is the final part for me, is with, like you said, the exercise selection, load selection, something like a dumbbell, right? You only have, 5 pound increments or 2.5 kilo increments or something like that. And maybe you can do the 10s for like 9 reps, but then you go up to the 15s, which is like a 50% load increase, and you're at like 2 or something like that. So with Bryan's example, with the cable lateral raise at the wrist height, the length and position, if you have like a gym pin or even one of the, like even using the default pin, many times you can bring over like a 2 pound weight, and you can increment that much more or much less, much smaller, which would be more conducive for, getting being able to use an appropriate load to produce, stimulus in that 5 to 8 rep range sort of thing there.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point too. I love the micro loading, and so you mentioned using the standard pin that's in there. Like you can just kind of wedge that pin out a little bit, or leave it as is, and just place the middle hole of the plate around the pin. Or what I do is I use my Angles 90 grips, and I just tie them to the stack, and then I loop a plate over the Angles 90 grip. And so there's a number of different ways that you can kind of micro load if that's your jam, and you're trying to kind of stay in that rep range with these more single joint movements. And then obviously it's not as big of a deal for compound movements, where loading is a little bit easier with 5-pound increments. And then the last thing I think on this in the comments is someone asked about whether this means that they should train, I think it was less frequently with closer proximities to failure. And so I thought the less frequently part was interesting because I didn't see any reference to that. So I thought it was interesting that someone would intuit that this infographic would mean that they should train with slightly less frequencies. But Chris Beardsley was like, yeah, I think that in general, closer to failure with less frequency is a good idea. And so I wonder, I'd love to see like a follow-up post of some sort, but it got me thinking about whether there's something to training it less frequently, in that maybe it takes longer for the high threshold motor units to recover between sessions, or maybe the idea of going to failure on these movements in these rep ranges somehow has like a longer recovery curve. But you do see Chris and Paul often discuss that training a muscle group every 5 to 7 days, or even doing like a bro split thing, seems to be just as good as, the more evidence-based 2 times a week approach. And we've discussed this as well in prior episodes, how it seems like the paradigm has shifted in that the bro split is making a comeback. But I'm very interested in it because there's also posts by Beardsley. Like I swear there was a post by Beardsley last year that said that muscle loss begins occurring 48 hours after your last session for a muscle group in an advanced athlete. So he's basically like, look, this muscle loss that is occurring isn't anything you're going to see. It's not going to show up on a DEXA. Like it's just happening. Like if you're an advanced athlete and you've provided this stimulus to your body over many years, it just, as soon as MPS stops processing, which is 24 hours for an advanced athlete or even less, whereas you get 72 plus hours of MPS elevation for like a new athlete or something like that, it seems like the advanced athlete then, according to this other infographic by Beardsley, is actually beginning to lose muscle within a day or two of training a muscle group, which is just interesting and kind of flies in the face of the way that people usually look at this stuff, or even at the Deload study that we saw, or the detraining study. Like it's all, there's all this information out there, and it's like, even if we are losing muscle in a day or two after we stop training, it's clear that that doesn't mean that we should train that muscle group every day or two. And that's not what Chris and Paul are promoting either. But it's just interesting how there's all this conflicting information out there. And if you were somebody somewhat new to training or new to social media, you literally could get yourself in a flurry with all of the different perspectives that are coming in this case, even from the same person. So yeah, it's a wild world out there.
Yeah, it really, really is. But I think things are getting better. At least I feel that way. But maybe that's because, we are fortunate that we are surrounded by pretty decent information sources, and we have decades of, fucking things up and learning the hard way sort of thing. So.
I mean, in some ways, it actually like breeds into the nihilistic thinking. And we can go back to episode 100 where we did evidence-based nihilism, where we broke down all these studies of like, hey, nothing really fucking matters at all. And in some ways, that's like the more advanced I get, it's like train with a bro split, train 3 times a week on a full body routine, go to failure, don't go to failure, do a bunch of sets, don't do a bunch of sets. Like at some level, like if you do the shit long enough over time, you're probably going to get to the same place. And so it's fun to discuss this nuance and really analyze it and work for those marginal gains. I love that term, marginal gains, because it really is like putting in so much effort for such a small return at this stage. But at the end of the day, like we don't know enough to even know if marginal gains, like we're doing the right thing to get the marginal gains. Like we think we are, because evidence says, hey, for most people, this probably will work. But you might not be that person. You might be the outlier. And then for you, something else works. And so there's so many roads to Rome. And that's what makes this also interesting and fun and exciting to follow the evidence-based space, but also extremely frustrating at times.
Agreed. I think it's a really, really good spot to wrap this one up. Anything to add before we do, Bryan?
No, let's get some kids to school, man.
All right, let's get some kids to school. As always, guys, thank you for listening.